How does someone spend 10 straight minutes tearing down a rookie quarterback, only to turn around and say they'd start him immediately? That's not analysis. That's a meltdown. And that's exactly what just happened on live radio, and now the internet is on fire because of it. Shedeur Sanders didn't throw a tantrum. He didn't call anyone out. He didn't post cryptic messages or leak stories. All he did was exist in the Browns' quarterback room. And somehow, that alone was enough for a respected NFL reporter to say Shedeur doesn't belong in the league, that he's one of the worst quarterbacks in the last 25 years, and that coaches would literally avoid Cleveland just because he's there. Wild, right? But here, where it gets crazy. Minutes later, same show, same conversation, that exact same reporter admitted that if the Browns had to choose between Shedeur Sanders and their $200+ million quarterback, he'd start Shedeur. No hesitation, no pause, every time. So which one is it? Is Shedeur so bad he shouldn't even be on the roster? Or is he clearly the better option under center right now? Because both things can't be true, yet somehow, that contradiction went out over the air like no one would notice. And that's why this story matters. This isn't just about one hot take. This is about how narratives get built, how rookie quarterbacks get buried before they ever get a fair shot, and how media voices can completely lose the plot when they're desperate to be right. The more you listen to what was said versus what actually happened, the more obvious it becomes. Someone got exposed on live radio, and it was Shedeur Sanders. It all started as a normal sports radio conversation. Coaching changes, front office pressure, the usual Browns dysfunction that fans are unfortunately used to. Jason Lloyd was on the air talking about Kevin Stefanski being shown the door, breaking down what went wrong, who deserves blame, and what the organization should do next. Nothing out of the ordinary, until one name came up. Shedeur Sanders. The second his name entered the discussion, the tone completely shifted. What followed wasn't measured criticism or cautious evaluation. It was a full-blown unload. Jason didn't just question Shedeur's play, he questioned his very presence in the building. He said Shedeur would be a hindrance to future coaching candidates, that some coaches would look at Cleveland and say, "Nope, I want nothing to do with that." Not because of the roster, not because of ownership, not because the Browns have been a mess for decades, but because of Shedeur. Then came the language that really raised eyebrows. Jason talked about the stupidity and nonsense surrounding Shedeur, the circus, the distraction, the implication that everything Kevin Stefanski went through over the past year somehow traced back to a rookie quarterback who barely even played. That's a heavy accusation, and one that instantly caught people's attention. What made it even stranger was how little of this criticism was actually about football. It wasn't about bad reads in a specific game or missing throws in key moments. It was about vibes, optics, media questions, the noise around his last name, the idea that Shedeur's existence creates chaos by default. And Jason presented it like this was obvious, like everyone in the league agreed and we were all late to the memo. But here, where listeners started leaning forward, because as harsh as that sounded, Jason wasn't done. He doubled down by saying Shedeur didn't even play that well when he got his chance, that he struggled with coverages, struggled with protections, didn't know when he was hot. He brought up touchdowns, turnovers, metrics, all framed to support one conclusion. Shedeur Sanders isn't just bad, he's historically bad. And at that moment, the conversation crossed a line. This wasn't skepticism anymore. This was a complete teardown. A declaration that Shedeur doesn't belong, that he's a problem, that his presence alone poisons the well. And as shocking as that sounded live on air, no one knew yet that the most damaging part of the segment was what Jason said about Shedeur. It was what he was about to say next. Here, where things stopped being about football and started feeling personal. Jason Lloyd wasn't just breaking down bad throws or missed reads anymore. The argument shifted from what Shedeur did on the field to what he supposedly represents off it. And that's a dangerous turn, because once you move away from tape and into perception, facts stop mattering. The word that kept popping up was circus, media circus, distraction, noise, as if Shedeur personally invited cameras into the building and demanded the spotlight, as if he was the one scheduling interviews, pushing storylines, or forcing his name into every press conference. But none of that actually happened. Shedeur didn't call the media called him. And when microphones were put in his face, he answered like every other quarterback in the league is expected to do. That's the part that never seems to get addressed. What exactly was Shedeur supposed to do differently? Walk out of the room, refuse to answer questions, tell reporters, "Sorry, my dad's famous, so I can't speak today." The so-called noise wasn't created by Shedeur. It was created by coverage choices, segment producers, and hot take culture feeding off his last name. And yet, that noise somehow became his fault. What makes this even more bizarre is that there were no real reports of locker room issues, no teammates calling him out, no coaches hinting at problems behind the scenes, no stories about him being late, unprepared, or difficult to work with. By all accounts, he showed up, worked, studied, and waited for his opportunity. That's it. That's the crime. But in Jason's framing, perception became reality. The idea that because people talked about Shedeur, he must be the problem. That because questions were asked about him, he must be causing instability. It's guilt by association, and it's incredibly convenient. You don't have to prove anything. You just gesture vaguely at everything around him and move on. And that's when listeners started to realize something wasn't adding up. Because if the biggest knock on a rookie quarterback isn't his effort, his attitude, or his preparation, but the fact that people won't stop talking about him, then you're no longer evaluating a player. You're judging a narrative. And narratives are easy to tear down players with, especially rookies, especially ones who haven't had time to defend themselves on the field. But as harsh as this framing was, it still wasn't the moment that broke the entire argument. That came when Jason tried to back it all up with the numbers, because that's where the story really started to fall apart. This is where Jason Lloyd tried to slam the door shut, after framing Shedeur as a distraction and a liability. He reached for the ultimate closer, the numbers. He said Shedeur struggled with coverages, struggled with protections, didn't know when he was hot. He brought up the turnovers. He pointed to the touchdown total. And then he dropped the line that instantly went viral, calling Shedeur one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL over the last 25 years statistically. That's not a critique. That's a sentence designed to end debate. But the moment you slow it down, the claim starts wobbling. Because what are we actually talking about here? A handful of starts. A rookie quarterback thrown into live NFL action mid-chaos, behind an inconsistent offensive line, in an offense that was already sputtering, with a coaching staff coaching for its own survival. That's the sample size being used to declare a career dead on arrival. Context matters, and Jason stripped all of it away. Those last two games, stats everyone keeps repeating, those were literally Shedeur's first real NFL starts. His first time seeing full-speed disguises. His first time dealing with NFL pass rushers who don't miss assignments. His first time trying to run an offense that had been unstable all season. And suddenly, that's supposed to define him for the next 25 years of quarterback history. That's not how football evaluation works. At least, it's not supposed to. If that standard were applied consistently, half the league's quarterbacks would have been written off before they ever developed. Peyton Manning led the league in interceptions as a rookie. Josh Allen looked completely lost early on. Baker Mayfield was labeled reckless and inaccurate in Cleveland until he was. Rookie struggles are not an obituary. They're part of the job. And the metrics prove it. Argument sounds strong until you realize metrics don't explain situation. They don't explain broken protections. They don't explain conservative play calling. They don't explain a quarterback knowing one mistake might get him benched while the entire organization is spiraling. Numbers tell you what happened. They don't tell you why. What made the claim even harder to swallow was the confidence behind it. Jason didn't say Shedeur was struggling. He didn't say he needs development. He said he was historically bad. Full stop. No patience. No runway. No acknowledgement of circumstances. And that's the moment many listeners started checking out, because the take felt less like analysis and more like a verdict that had already been decided. But even then, no one expected what was coming next. Because just minutes after declaring Shedeur one of the worst ever, Jason Lloyd would say something that completely blew up his own argument and exposed the entire segment in real time. Just when it seemed like the verdict on Shedeur Sanders had been finalized, the conversation took an unexpected turn. One of the hosts asked a simple, straightforward question. No traps, no drama, just a hypothetical that every Browns fan has already asked themselves at least once. If you had to choose a starting quarterback for next season, Shedeur Sanders or Deshaun Watson? After everything that had just been said, the answer should have been obvious. If Shedeur is truly one of the worst quarterbacks in the last 25 years, if he doesn't belong on the roster, if his presence scares away coaching candidates, then this should have been an easy call. You take literally anyone else. You don't hesitate. But that's not what happened. Jason Lloyd didn't pause, he didn't hedge, he didn't say neither. He said Shedeur every time, and then he said it again. Every time. That was the moment the entire segment collapsed under its own weight. Think about what that admission actually means. Deshaun Watson isn't just another quarterback on the roster. He's the highest paid player in franchise history. The Browns have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into him. They've defended him. They've waited on him. They've reshaped the entire organization around him. And despite all of that, the same person who just spent 10 minutes torching Shedeur would still rather start the rookie. You can't square that circle. If Shedeur is so bad he shouldn't be in the NFL, then why would you trust him over Watson? And if he's clearly the better option than Watson right now, then how can you justify calling him historically awful just minutes earlier? Those two positions cannot exist at the same time, yet Jason stated both with complete confidence. That's why listeners immediately zeroed in on this moment. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This wasn't taken out of context. This was a direct contradiction, live on air with no attempt to reconcile it. 1 minute, Shedeur is a roster problem. The next, he's the obvious starter. And once that happened, everything else Jason said before it became questionable. If your evaluation flips that dramatically under one basic question, then maybe the take wasn't built on careful analysis in the first place. Maybe it was built on frustration, or narrative, or the pressure to sound definitive on radio. Whatever the reason, that single answer did more damage than any stat ever could, because it showed that even Jason Lloyd doesn't truly believe what he said about Shedeur Sanders. And once the audience realized that, the focus shifted fast away from the quarterback and straight onto the credibility of the person criticizing him. The reaction was immediate. Clips started circulating. Quotes were replayed side by side. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about Shedeur Sanders anymore. It was about how a media narrative completely unraveled in real time. Fans didn't just disagree with Jason Lloyd. They caught him contradicting himself, and once that door opened, everything else came under scrutiny. What people started asking was simple. If this evaluation was so obvious, so definitive, why did it fall apart under one follow-up question? That's when frustration with the media boiled over, because this wasn't just one bad take. It felt like the same pattern fans have seen over and over again. A young quarterback enters a dysfunctional situation. Early struggles get magnified. Context gets ignored. And instead of allowing time for development, the narrative hardens into something unmovable. Once that happens, every mistake becomes proof, and every positive moment gets brushed aside. In Shedeur's case, it was even worse because the criticism wasn't consistent. On one hand, he was painted as a locker room liability, a distraction, a problem coaches didn't want to deal with. On the other, he was acknowledged as the best option available. Those two things don't align, and people noticed. That's why the backlash didn't feel like blind fan defense. It felt like pushback against selective logic, against moving the goalposts to fit a pre-written conclusion. When Jason said Shedeur shouldn't even be on the team, fans went back and asked, "Then why would you start him?" When he cited stats, fans looked at sample size. When he talked about noise, fans asked for actual examples. And that's where the argument fell flat. There weren't any concrete answers, no reports of locker room tension, no coaches speaking out, no teammates leaking frustration, just vibes and perception, just everyone knows energy without evidence to back it up. The bigger issue here is trust. Sports media relies on credibility. Listeners assume that when someone speaks with authority, the opinion is at least internally consistent. When that consistency breaks, so does confidence in the analysis. And once people stop trusting the messenger, the message doesn't matter anymore. That's why Jason Lloyd became the story. Not because fans are sensitive, not because Shedeur has a loud fan base, but because the critique felt less like football breakdown and more like narrative protection. Like someone refusing to admit that maybe, just maybe, they were too quick to close the book on a rookie quarterback. And when that happens, fans don't just defend the player, they start questioning who's really creating the noise. Once you strip away the radio soundbites and the online outrage, you're left with the part that actually matters, what happened between the lines. And this is where the story gets a lot more nuanced than the worst quarterback in 25 years, label people keep throwing around. Shedeur didn't walk into a stable situation. He stepped into a season that was already falling apart. The offensive line was inconsistent week to week. Protections broke down early and often. Play calling felt cautious, almost afraid to let anything breathe. And all of this was happening while the coaching staff knew their jobs were on the line. That's not exactly an environment designed for a rookie quarterback to thrive. Yes, there were mistakes. There were missed reads. There were turnovers. No one is pretending otherwise. But that's the baseline experience for almost every rookie quarterback who sees real snaps in the NFL, especially ones who aren't eased in, who aren't surrounded by stability, and who don't have the luxury of learning behind a locked-in veteran starter. Shedeur was learning on the fly against NFL speed with very little margin for error. And despite that, there were flashes, real ones. He showed pocket awareness when plays broke down. He extended drives with his legs when protection collapsed. He made throws into tight windows that simply aren't on the menu for quarterbacks who don't belong in the league. Those moments didn't always show up on the stat sheet, but they showed up on tape, and tape is what coaches actually care about. The touchdown argument gets thrown around a lot, but it's missing context. Those early starts weren't about putting up numbers. They were about survival, about not getting overwhelmed, about adjusting to coverages and pressure packages that move faster than anything you see in college. Judging a quarterback's future off 2 early games is how teams end up making the same mistakes over and over again. And here's the part critics don't like to acknowledge. Shedeur, even while struggling, showed things the Browns haven't consistently seen in years. Poise, mobility, the ability to keep a play alive when the structure fails. Those are traits you can't coach. You either have them or you don't. Was he polished? No. Was he finished? Absolutely not. The on-field reality sits somewhere in the middle, far from elite, but nowhere near the disaster some people want him to be. And when you look at the situation honestly, it becomes clear that Shedeur wasn't exposed on the field. He was tested in chaos. And that raises a bigger question. If this is what he looked like in the worst possible circumstances, what would he look like with actual stability? This is the part of the story that rarely gets said out loud, but it explains almost everything. The narrative around Shedeur Sanders didn't form because of what happened on the field. It formed because a lot of people made up their minds about him long before he ever took a meaningful snap in the NFL. There's been skepticism attached to Shedeur since the day he entered the draft. His last name, his dad, the cameras, the attention. For some people, that was enough to assume the worst, that he'd be entitled, that he'd be a distraction, that the hype would outweigh the substance. And once that assumption takes hold, every single moment gets filtered through it. A bad read isn't just a bad read, it's proof he doesn't get it. A turnover isn't just a rookie mistake, it's confirmation he was overrated all along. Meanwhile, the same grace given to other young quarterbacks somehow disappears. Development becomes a luxury reserved for players without a spotlight. And that's where the media plays a huge role. Hot takes get rewarded. Definitive statements get clicks. Saying it's too early to tell doesn't light up a segment, but saying this guy doesn't belong does. Once someone goes that far publicly, it becomes very hard to walk it back. So instead of adjusting the take when new information shows up, the narrative has to be defended, even if that means contradicting yourself without realizing it. That's why the noise argument is so convenient. It shifts blame away from football and into something vague and unprovable. You don't have to show tape. You don't have to explain scheme. You just say teams don't want to deal with it and move on. It sounds authoritative, even when there's no evidence behind it. But here's the irony. The biggest source of noise around Shedeur is Shedeur. It's the constant debate about whether he deserves to be there at all. It's the exaggerated criticism, the rush to extremes, the refusal to let a rookie be a rookie. That's what keeps the story alive. And when someone like Jason Lloyd goes that hard, that publicly, and then immediately undermines his own argument, it exposes something uncomfortable. Maybe this was never about an honest evaluation. Maybe it was about being early, about planting a flag, about proving a prediction right at all costs. Because if you truly believe Shedeur is hopeless, you don't turn around and start him every time. That slip tells you everything you need to know. The narrative isn't as solid as it pretends to be, and deep down, even the people pushing it seem to know that. When you zoom out and look at everything that happened, the answer becomes pretty clear. This was never really about Shedeur Sanders being the problem. It was about how quickly opinions harden in the NFL world, and how uncomfortable it gets when those opinions start contradicting themselves in public. Shedeur didn't demand a starting job. He didn't call out coaches. He didn't divide a locker room or hijack a franchise. He showed up to a broken situation, did what he was asked, struggled like most rookies do, and showed flashes that suggested there might be something worth developing. That's it. That's the full resume so far. And somehow, that turned into claims that he doesn't belong in the league at all. Meanwhile, the person making those claims couldn't even stick to them for a full radio segment. Calling a rookie one of the worst quarterbacks in 25 years, and then saying you'd start him immediately over your franchise quarterback isn't strong analysis. It's confusion wrapped in confidence. And once listeners caught that, the entire argument collapsed. That's why this story flipped the way it did. Fans weren't blindly defending Shedeur. They were reacting to inconsistency, to a take that tried to sound definitive while ignoring context, patience, and basic logic. You can criticize a young quarterback without erasing him. You can acknowledge struggles without pretending development is impossible. But when you jump straight to extremes, you leave yourself nowhere to go when reality pushes back. The truth sits in the middle, whether people like it or not. Shedeur Sanders isn't a finished product. He's not a guaranteed star, but he's also not some untouchable disaster who scares away coaching candidates just by being in the building. He's a young quarterback who was dropped into chaos and judged like he was supposed to fix it overnight. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway here. The Browns are still a mess. The quarterback situation is still unresolved. The organization is still paying for mistakes it refuses to fully confront. Yet somehow, a rookie with minimal control over any of that became the lightning rod. That doesn't say much about him, but it says a lot about how narratives work when teams fail and someone has to wear it. So when people ask who really got exposed on live radio, the answer isn't hard. It wasn't the rookie still trying to find his footing. It was the take that couldn't survive its own logic. And until Shedeur actually gets a real, stable opportunity to be evaluated, everything else is just noise pretending to be certainty.